Hello everyone, welcome back. So today we'll be talking about the meaning of accepting or rejecting a hypothesis. So in the last video we had talked about your methods of hypothesis testing. So we had talked about two methods, your confidence interval approach and your level of significance approach. So today we'll be talking about the meaning of accepting or rejecting a hypothesis. So we'll discuss whether this is the right term to use or not, or we can use the term not rejecting a hypothesis. Right? So let's move ahead. So if on the basis of a test of significance, say suppose we have done a t-test, done a t-test, okay, we decide to accept the null hypothesis. If on the basis of a test of significance, supposingly t-test, we decide that we accept a null hypothesis. So all we are trying to say is, so we decide to accept the null. So all we are saying is that on the basis of sample evidence, on the basis of sample evidence, we have no reason, we have no reason to reject the hypothesis. Reject the hypothesis. Okay, so the key term here is the sample evidence. So depending upon the sample or the value of my estimated parameter, okay, or the estimated value of the parameter is such that it allows me to not reject the null or accept the null. Okay, so had the sample been a different sample, so in that situation, my acceptance or rejection of the hypothesis would have been different. So it is totally situational based on your sample. Okay, so for a given sample, you might not reject a hypothesis. Okay, so we are not saying, so if we do this, if we do not reject or if we accept the null, we are not saying, we are not saying that the null hypothesis, that the null hypothesis is true beyond doubt. So what this means is, for a given hypothesis H naught, null hypothesis H naught, and for a given sample, if I decide to accept the null, it means that it is true for this sample. It is not saying that in any situation given, the null hypothesis will be true, or it's not saying that there is no doubt whatsoever uh, in accepting a particular null hypothesis or rejecting, depends, like whatever we are doing for a given sample. So it is totally situational. Okay, so whenever we accept or reject a hypothesis, it is based on the sample evidence that we have and the hypothesis that we have created. Okay, so for a different hypothesis and for a different sample, the result might be different, or for the same hypothesis and a different sample, the result might be different. So it is all situational. So for example, if this is a imaginary example, okay, so just to give you an idea what this means. So if suppose H naught is beta 2 is equal to 0.70, beta 2 hat is equal to 0.7241. Standard error of beta 2 hat is equal to 0.0701. For this, the t value comes out to be 0.7241 minus 0.7 upon 0.01. So which will come out to be roughly 0.3438. Okay. So this is for your null when your beta 2 value is equal to, or your null hypothesis is saying that your beta 2 value is equal to 0.70. Now suppose if, and for this case, for this t value, I accept the null hypothesis. Okay. So I'm just, this is an example. Okay. So suppose this is the case where for this t value, I have to accept the null. Okay. Similarly, if I take h naught for the same case, for the same values of beta 2 hat, standard error of beta 2 hat, I take the null to be 0.60. Then my t value comes out to be 1.7703. So suppose for the given confidence interval and the level of significance, this t value is also allowing me to accept the null. Okay. Okay. So if I am also accepting the null at 0.70, and I'm also accepting the null hypothesis as at the value of 0.60, then which hypothesis is true? Like what is the actual value, or what is the value of beta 2 that I should uh, assume to be true? So what the point here is that we can have a range of hypotheses. Okay. Or we can have a range of your null hypothesis values for which the null might not be not be rejected. Okay, so there is a range of values of beta 2. Okay, so it's not that there's an individual value for which our entire evidence is backing it up. So there can be multiple values for which we have evidence, and uh, so our estimation is not for a single value, but it is for a range of values. So we can have multiple null hypothesis being true. Okay, it's not that uh, there is evidence for a single and only unique hypothesis or the value of beta 2 that has to be true. Okay, so therefore in accepting a null hypothesis, we should always be aware that another null hypothesis might be equally compatible with the data. So whatever data I've chosen to test my null hypothesis, so for a given hypothesis, the data might give evidence in favor of the hypothesis, but for a different hypothesis also, just like we saw when beta 2 was zero point 0.7 and beta 2 was also zero point 0.6. So in both the hypotheses, okay, the data is giving me evidence to not reject the null or accept the null. Okay, so this can be a case. So the meaning of accepting or rejecting a hypothesis is basically situational. It depends on the data and the hypothesis that you've chosen, and the same data can give you evidence in favor or against the favor of a particular hypothesis. Okay, of different hypotheses. Okay, so in one case it might give you in favor of it, in the other it might give you against of it, or there might also be a case where the same data is giving you uh, evidence in favor of two different hypotheses. Okay, so it's majorly situational. So the analogy that we can draw here is from the court verdicts. Okay. So just as a court pronounces a verdict, it says not guilty. Okay. Given the evidence in hand. So the court pronouncing this verdict is also depending upon the situation, which is the evidence that is being provided to the court. Okay. So it does not say that the culprit or whoever the party is accused of something is found innocent. Okay. So the evidence that we have is to prove that the person is not guilty. The evidence doesn't point to the fact that the person or the entity, whatever it is innocent. Okay, that's how the null hypothesis or the hypothesis, the acceptance or rejection of it works. Okay, so we have evidence to not reject it or not reject a hypothesis or accept. So that is why we don't usually use the term accept. Okay, accept. So we usually or majorly say that we do not reject, do not reject the null hypothesis. So you can draw this analogy and you can always remember that why we use this term. Okay, because we have evidence to not reject it, but it is not a sure evidence to say that okay, we are totally accepting this hypothesis in any given condition. Okay, so in some condition the same hypothesis might not be true, right? So how do you formulating a null or alternate hypothesis? So this is something intuitive. So whoever is doing this job, he has to use or she has to use his or her intuition to define a null hypothesis and the associated alternative hypothesis. Okay, so theoretical theoretical expectations. Okay, uh, for example, higher risk imply higher reward. Okay, so this is something that is very intuitive, and uh, we have theoretical evidence of these this particular equation. Okay, so these type of things are your prior empirical work. Okay, so where we have data to prove something, so these type of things allow you to formulate a hypothesis using your own sense or your own belief or your own intuition. Okay, so let me give you an example. Suppose ei is equal to beta 1 plus beta 2 sigma I. This is expected returns on a security. Okay, sigma is the standard deviation of returns, and this is basically a measure of the risk associated with the security security underlying security, risk associated with the security. So by intuition I know that higher this value, higher this value, higher the risk, higher the return. Okay, so I know that my beta 2 cannot be 0 because there is a positive relationship between risk and reward, right? So if I take the null hypothesis which says that beta 2 is equal to 0 h naught, so automatically my alternative hypothesis becomes that beta 2 is greater than 0, and I'll try to uh, reject this null hypothesis with the given evidence because I know by intuition that this is true. Okay, and with the help of data or the empirical analysis that I'll do, I'll try to reject this null. Okay, so I'll try to gather evidence around uh, this null hypothesis. So this is how you create a null and an alternative hypothesis and you try to test it. So I hope there was something of significance to be learned from this video, and I'll see you in the next video. Till then, take care.